The morning the last crate arrived, it was a Tuesday in late October of 2009, and the frost had come down hard enough the night before to leave a skin of ice on the water troughs that hadn't melted by 8 o'clock. I remember that detail because I had already been out twice to break it, before I heard the truck come up the county road. And when it pulled in, I was standing at the fence with a hammer in my hand and my breath hanging in the air in little clouds. And the driver looked at me the way men look at each other when neither one of them is entirely sure of what they're doing, but both of them are too far into it to stop. He had driven 4 hours and 20 minutes from a dispersal sale over in the next county, and what he had in the back of that truck, stacked in 2 ventilated wooden crates lined with straw that had seen better days, was 7 hens. Not a rooster among them. 7 hens of a breed that, by the consensus of nearly everyone I had spoken to in the previous 6 months, was as finished as a thing gets without being officially declared gone. I had paid $43 for all 7 of them, plus the gas money I wired the driver, which brought my total investment to somewhere around $92, and a considerable portion of my own credibility, which, in a small farming community, is a currency you cannot easily earn back once you've spent it on the wrong thing. My neighbor Raymond came by that afternoon. Raymond drives a truck that always looks like it just came off a dealer's lot, and he has a way of leaning on a fence post with his arms crossed that communicates everything he thinks without him having to say much of it out loud. He stood there and looked at those 7 hens working around in the corner of the pen I'd set up. And he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, with a kind of politeness that is worse than rudeness because it gives you nowhere to go, he said, "What exactly is the plan here?" I told him I was farming. He looked at the hens again. He looked at me. He said, "There's a reason nobody's running those anymore." And I said, "I know it." And he said, "Well," and then he got back in his clean truck and drove down the lane. And I stood there with the hammer I was still holding and watched the dust settle behind him, and I was not as certain as I had sounded. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and by my understanding, the version had grown. And in the version circulating by supper time, I had apparently paid considerably more than $43 and had considerably less sense than God gave a fence post. I heard that secondhand from my wife Doris, who delivered it the way she delivers most things, which is straight and without decoration. And then she asked me one question. She said, "How many eggs are we talking about, if this goes the way you think it goes?" That was the question that mattered. I told her what I believed, and she thought about it for a minute, and then went back to what she was doing, which is as close as Doris gets to a formal endorsement. I want to be honest about my reasons, because I think the honest version of this story is more useful than the flattering one. I did not take on those 7 hens because I was visionary or because I had done some deep market analysis on a spreadsheet. I took them on because of something my grandmother told me when I was 11 years old. Standing in her chicken yard on a morning not unlike that October morning, watching a flock that moved and fed and settled in a way I have never quite seen duplicated since. She said to me, "Some things get let go before anybody thinks to ask why they were kept so long in the first place." That was all she said. She went back inside, and I stood there in the yard, and I was 11 and didn't fully understand it, and I filed it away in the place where children file things, that adults say, that feel important but don't yet have a shape. And I didn't think about it again for decades, not consciously, not as a guiding principle. But when the dispersal sale notice crossed my path in the summer of 2009 and I read the breed name and sat with it for a minute, something in me went back to that chicken yard without my permission, and I picked up the phone. Her name was Ruth, my grandmother. She died in 1987 at the age of 79, and she kept chickens her entire adult life, the way some people keep a practice, a daily and serious thing attended to with care and not much ceremony. She was not sentimental about it. She kept records. That is the fact that changes this whole story. And I need you to understand the weight of that sentence, because it is the thing everything else hangs on. She kept records. I found the notebook in March of 2010, which is to say I found it 5 months after those 7 hens arrived, which is to say I found it 5 months later than I should have, because I had known it was somewhere in the house since the week after the truck came up the lane, and I had not gone looking for it with any real intent. I'll own that. I put it off the way a man puts off reading something he suspects is going to ask something of him. I had seen it once before, years earlier, when we were clearing out a cedar chest after my mother passed, and I remembered the cover, which was dark green and cloth-bound and worn at the corners, and I remembered thinking I should look at it properly someday, and then I didn't, and the chest went into the back of the spare room, and the notebook went with it. And 5 months passed with 7 hens in my side yard before I finally sat down on the edge of the spare room bed on a Sunday morning in March and opened it. The handwriting was my grandmother's. Careful and small, the way people wrote when they learned on lined paper, with real stakes attached to getting it right. The notebook covered, as best as I could calculate from the dates, a span of roughly 31 years, from sometime in the middle 1952 through to the mid-1980s. It was not a journal. It was not personal in that way. It was technical and specific. Dates of laying, notes on feed ratios, observations about seasonal behavior, notes about culling decisions and the reasoning behind them, occasionally a sketch of a comb or a foot or a marking that she wanted to record. It was the kind of document that takes a lifetime to produce and 5 minutes to throw away. And I am grateful beyond my ability to say it plainly that nobody threw it away. There were 146 pages of it, front and back, written in pencil, that had gone brown with the years. And I sat there and read it, cover to cover that morning, and did not stop for anything, not breakfast, not coffee, nothing. And when I finished, I sat still for a while in the spare room with the thin March light coming through the window, and the notebook in my hands, and I thought about my grandmother and her chicken yard, and about how much she had known and kept to herself in that modest, practical way of hers. And then I went and found Doris, and I said, "I need to show you something." And she came and looked, and she said, "Did you read the page with the corner folded down?" And I said, "No, I came straight to find you." And she handed it back to me and said, "You should read that page." The corner was folded on page 88. The entry was dated a Thursday in September of 1971, and it began as a standard seasonal note about the transition into shorter days and the corresponding change in laying behavior, written in the same careful hand as everything else, and then partway down the page the handwriting changed its character, not the letter forms, but the pressure of it. The way handwriting changes when the person holding the pencil has moved from recording to thinking. And at the bottom of that entry, underlined twice in pencil and followed by a question mark, were 11 words. They said, "Cold tolerance, not in the literature. Ask if anyone has measured this properly." I stood there in the spare room with that folded page open in my hands, and I read those 11 words 4 times. And the 4th time I read them, I understood that my grandmother had noticed something in 1971 that nobody had followed up on, and that the question mark at the end was not a closing thought, but an open door, and that she had left it there, underlined on a folded page, in a notebook she had kept for 30 years, and she had hoped, I believe, that whoever came after her would be the kind of person who went through the whole thing, and not just the first few pages. Cold tolerance, not in the literature. Ask if anyone has measured this properly. I am going to take the rest of this story at the pace it deserves, because there is a habit in our time of getting to the answer before the question has had its full weight, and I think that habit costs us something, and I think my grandmother would agree with me. So I want to walk through what I did with those 11 words, and how I did it, and what I found. Because the finding is only meaningful if you understand the looking. The week after I read the notebook, I drove to the University Extension office in the county seat, and I sat down with a woman named Dr. Aldrich, who had been running poultry research there for going on 14 years, and whose opinions on production breeds I had previously had some respect for. I brought the notebook, I showed her the page, I read her the 11 words. She looked at them, and she looked at me, and she said with the genuine and thoughtful kindness of someone who doesn't want to discourage an older man from his hobby. She said that cold tolerance, as a formal heritable trait, had been studied fairly extensively in the standard commercial lines, and that the literature was not as thin as my grandmother seemed to think it was, and that the breed I was working with had been assessed and found to fall within normal parameters, and she showed me 2 papers to support that, published in 1983 and 1991, and they did say what she said they said. I thanked her and drove home, and I sat with it. I sat with it for 3 days. And then I decided that normal parameters was not the same as measured properly, and that my grandmother had been a more careful observer than a 1983 survey with a sample size of 12 birds, and I went back out to the pen. I want to describe what I had been watching all winter without quite naming it, because naming it before I had any support for it felt like the kind of thinking that gets a man laughed out of more than one diner. Those 7 hens, from the first cold week of November onward, had been doing something I had not seen in other flocks in my experience, and I have kept chickens in one form or another for most of my adult life. They were not huddling in the way that cold birds huddle, which is to say they were not showing the bunched, tucked, minimal movement posture that birds show when they are spending energy on survival and not on much else. They were active. They were foraging, genuinely foraging, at temperatures where my other birds had retreated entirely to the shelter. On the mornings in January, when the thermometer read 8 degrees before sunrise, I would come out at first light and find them working the yard with a steadiness that I could not account for. Their combs were clean. Their condition was good. They were laying, not at summer rates, but laying, in February, in a coop with no supplemental heat, at temperatures that had stopped my other birds cold since December. I had not wanted to say any of this out loud because I was aware of how it would sound. But it was what I had been watching all winter, and when I went back to the notebook, I found entries that described the same behavior, dated November and December and January across multiple years, in my grandmother's careful, unpressured hand. She had seen it. She had known it was real. She had just wanted somebody else to measure it. I am not a scientist. I want to be clear about that and clear about what I mean by clear. I don't have the training, the equipment, or the vocabulary to run a controlled study, and I am not going to claim that what I did constitutes one. What I did was methodical, which is a different and humbler thing. I divided the pen in February of 2010, and I ran a side-by-side comparison across the rest of that winter and into the following December, using 6 of my standard breed hens as the comparison group. Same feed, same water management, same square footage per bird, same exposure, the only variable being the breed. I kept a notebook. It was a composition book with a black and white cover that I bought at the feed store for 89 cents, and I recorded temperatures twice a day, at first light and at 2 in the afternoon, alongside behavioral observations and egg counts. I did this for 14 months. I wrote down what I saw. I did not write down what I hoped to see, or at least I tried not to, and I think on the whole I succeeded, because the record I produced was not a clean, flattering one. There were weeks where the difference was minimal. There were cold snaps where both groups pulled back, and I could not have told you with confidence which was managing better. I wrote all of that down too. What you want, when you're trying to see something true, is the full picture. And the full picture has dull patches in it. And a record that has no dull patches is a record that is lying to you. But over 14 months and through 2 full winter cycles, a pattern held. In temperatures below 20 degrees, sustained over 3 or more consecutive days, the 7 hens. And then their daughters, because I had gotten a rooster by May of 2010 and had my first hatched chicks by July. The birds of this line showed a behavioral and productivity profile that was consistently and measurably different from the comparison group. The difference in lay rate during the coldest 8 weeks of each winter was not marginal. In the winter of 2010 into 2011, the comparison group averaged 11 eggs per week across 6 birds during the 6 coldest weeks of January and February. The birds from my grandmother's line averaged 31 eggs per week across what was then 9 birds. I checked my math 3 times because I didn't trust it. The math held. I took my composition book, along with a copy of the relevant pages from my grandmother's notebook, to a man named Gale, who ran a small specialty hatchery about 30 miles east. A man who had been in the poultry business in this state for going on 40 years and who was known, within the narrow circles where such things are known, as someone whose opinion on a bird was worth having, because he gave it slowly and he gave it straight. He was behind the counter when I came in, and he looked at me over his glasses when I set both notebooks down in front of him, and he said, "What have you got?" And I told him in the plainest terms I could manage what I'd been observing and what I'd recorded and what my grandmother had written in 1971. He didn't say anything. He read for a while. He turned pages. He went back to a page he'd already read and read it again. The shop was quiet. A radio was on somewhere in the back, with a farm market report coming through in a half murmur. He set the composition book down and he looked at the copy of my grandmother's page, the one with the underlined 11 words, and he held it for a long moment, the way you hold something that is asking you to reconsider something you thought you already knew. He set it down. He looked up. He said one word. He said, "substantial." He said it the way a man says a word when the word is doing a lot of work. And then he asked me how many birds I was running. And I told him, and he went quiet again. And then he said, "I think you need to be running more," and I said, "I know it," and that was the whole conversation. The hatchery calls started in the spring of 2013, which means it took roughly 3 years from that conversation with Gale to the point where the word had moved far enough through the small and specific world of heritage poultry people to reach the people it needed to reach. The first call was from a small operation 2 counties over, a man who kept a mixed heritage flock for a farmer's market customer base, and who had heard from someone, who had heard from Gale, that there was a cold hardy line in this part of the state that was producing through the winter in ways that the standard breeds simply were not. He was skeptical on the phone. He had a right to be. I told him to come and see, and he came. And he walked the pen in silence for about 10 minutes, and then he asked me what I was selling breeding stock for, and I gave him a number that felt honest and not extravagant, and he bought 6 hens and 2 roosters, and drove home, and 3 weeks later he called back and asked if I had more. The calls did not stop after that. By the end of 2013, I had heard from 11 different operations in the state, ranging from small backyard flocks to one outfit that was running close to 400 birds on a hillside property and was looking for a line that would keep producing through the winters without the expense of supplemental heating that was eating into margins they couldn't. I sold into every one of those situations carefully and slowly, because the worst thing you can do with a gene pool that has been reduced to 7 birds is expand it recklessly without knowing what you are selecting for and what you are letting drift. I kept records on every bird I sold, and I asked every buyer to report back, and most of them did, and the ones who did confirmed what my composition book had told me, which was that the cold tolerance trait was heritable and consistent and real, and that it expressed itself reliably across different management systems and different microclimates within the state. Raymond came by in the fall of 2013, which was 4 years after he had leaned on that fence post, and asked me what the plan was. He pulled up in his clean truck, same as always, and he looked out the window at the yard, which by that time held close to 60 birds of various ages. And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That's a few more than you started with." I said it was. He looked at the flock a while longer. He said, "They seem to do all right in the cold." I said they did. He said, "Well," and then there was a pause. And he said, "I might have written you off too fast on this one." He said it matter-of-factly, the way you'd report a weather change. And then he rolled up his window and drove back down the lane. And that was that. No ceremony. No apology required. And none offered. Just a man who had been certain about something and was now less certain, and was willing to say so in plain words to the person it most concerned, and then get on with his day. In this country, That is as close to a full vindication as you are likely to get, and I have learned to accept it as enough. What I want to say now, and I want to say it as plainly as I can, because I think it is the actual point of this whole long story, is that the 11 words on page 88 were not luck. They were not an accident. They were the product of 31 years of daily attention, paid in full, recorded in a small notebook that cost my grandmother nothing but the patience to sit down with it every time something needed noting. She did not have a research budget. She did not have a title or a laboratory or a peer-reviewed publication behind her name. She had a chicken yard and a pencil, and the discipline to believe that what she was seeing was worth writing down even when nobody had asked her to write it down and nobody was likely to read it. That is a kind of faith that I find I have more respect for as I get older, not less. The credentialed answer told me that the breed was average and the literature was settled, and that I was within normal parameters, and I do not fault Dr. Aldrich for that because she was reading what existed and reading it correctly. What the literature didn't contain was my grandmother's 31 years of Tuesday mornings in January, watching birds that moved like it was October when everything around them had gone still and cold. There is a thing my grandmother said to me on another occasion when I was older, maybe 16 or 17, and I was being impatient about something the way young men are impatient. And she said, the thing that hasn't been written down yet is still true. She didn't offer any more than that. She went back to whatever she was doing, and I stood there with it, and now I am 67 years old, and I have been farming this ground for most of my adult life, and I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count, and it still opens up every time I come at it. The thing that hasn't been written down yet is still true. That is not an argument against science. That is an argument for the person in the chicken yard with the notebook and the patience and the willingness to ask if anyone has measured this properly, and then to wait, if they have to, for the right person to come along and pick up the question. The 7 hens I paid $43 for in October of 2009 are all gone now. Their daughters are gone too, and most of their granddaughters. But the line runs on through this farm, and through the farms of the people who bought from me, and who bought from them, and in the winter of this most recent January, when the temperature dropped to 6 degrees for 9 consecutive days, and most of the operations in this part of the state were losing production and paying for heat they hadn't budgeted for. I walked out to the yard at first light on the 4th morning of that cold snap, and my breath was hanging in the air in little clouds the way it was that October morning 15 years ago. And the birds were working the yard in the thin gray light like it was the middle of September, steady and unbothered. The way my grandmother's birds had worked her yard when I was 11 years old and didn't know enough to understand what I was seeing. I stood there for a while. I didn't have the hammer this time. I just stood there and watched them work, and I thought about a Tuesday morning in late October, and a truck coming up a county road, and a driver who'd come 4 hours and 20 minutes and 7 hens in 2 wooden crates, and I thought about a green notebook with worn corners in a cedar chest in the spare room, and I thought about 11 words on a folded page, and I thought about my grandmother standing in her chicken yard in the 1,950 seconds, and the 1,960 seconds, and the 1,970 seconds, watching and writing it all down for whoever came after her. And I felt the particular gratitude you feel when you understand that someone you loved did a thing of great value without ever asking for the credit, and trusted that the value would find its way to the surface eventually, the way water finds its way to the surface when the conditions are right, and the way patience, in the end, finds its way to being right too. My grandmother's name was Ruth Eleanor, and she kept chickens. She kept records. She kept a question open that she knew she might never get to answer herself, and she wrote it down on page 88 with the corner folded so it could be found. And she trusted that someone in her line would be stubborn enough, or curious enough, or both, to find it and follow it through. I was slow about it. I waited 5 months before I opened the notebook. I put the folded page off until Doris handed it back to me. I drove to the extension office, and sat with the established answer for 3 full days before I went back out to the pen and started looking for myself. I am not proud of the delays, but I did get there. And that is the part that mattered. And that is the part that counts. I think when you stand at the end of a thing and try to say what it was, the thing that hasn't been written down yet is still true. And the thing that has been written down by a patient woman in a careful hand on a folded page deserves to be found and followed before it is declared finished. That is what I know. That is what those 7 hens and their daughters and their daughters' daughters taught me, and what my grandmother taught me before any of them. In a chicken yard, on a cold morning when I was 11 years old, and the frost was still on the ground, like they had somewhere to be, and the weather was simply not a thing they had decided to worry about. If you have a piece of ground with something on it that everybody else has given up on, or an old notebook in a chest that you haven't opened yet, or a question somebody left you with a question mark after it, I'd be glad to hear about it in the comments. I read every one of them. Subscribe if any part of this meant something to you. We move slow on this channel, but I believe we get there.